The first few rounds of the 2016 British Chess Championship, certainly on the top boards, have been characterised by rather careful play, and definitely by the very best players. The top grandmasters seem content against their lower rated opponents to play risk-free chess, just careful in the opening, avoiding theoretical duels, just aiming to get to a tense middle game from which they can outplay their opponents. And so far, this approach seems to have been working. A typical example of this pragmatic attitude was seen in the game Michael Adams playing white against Richard Pert, which was my round 4 game of the day. Adams, of course, having a 280 point rating advantage over his opponent, would expect to beat Pert with white. But these things can never be guaranteed, and Pert is a highly skilled opponent, so Adams has got to be careful. And careful he was, as he opened with c4. And already I think this might have surprised Pert, because, you know, in 99 games out of 100, Adams plays e4. Pert responds in a rather classical way, just answering the English opening with typical response, e5 followed by the development of both knights, and after knight c3 to play bishop out to c5. Now this is an approach which was also favoured by his brother Nick Pert in the same round. We can't follow that game here, but it's not a bad approach for black. Of course, if you played like this as white against a Sicilian defence, you'd be branded as rather naive. But funnily enough, against the English, it's not too bad, because black's aims out of the opening are fairly modest. You're not trying to mount any sort of an attack, you're just getting your pieces out. And if white plays e3 and d4, which is the normal recipe playing against this exposed bishop, then black can often use the pawn on d4 as a target. And we're going to see something like that in the game, with Adams playing knight f3, both sides castling, and now here's this move e3, trying to play d4 without delay. And this is why Pert gives the bishop a square with a6. That might seem like a slight loss of time, but he's going to answer d4 with bishop a7. And now everything's going to hinge on whether this pawn is a target for black's pieces or not, or whether it simply cramps black and gives white an advantage in space. Just going back one move, I seem to remember, well, this system's not new with black. You know, it's been around for a long time. And I seem to remember in the theory books, I've got a series of books by John Watson on the English opening, that Watson favours a more restrained response with white, just going d3, a3, b3, bishop b2, queen d2, and delaying d4. Mickey goes through with the move straight away, Pert retreats, and now h3. Probably a necessary move, because black might be thinking about bishop g4 here, which would intensify the pressure against d4. Note that it's probably not good for white to block the position here, because that tends to bring the bishop on a7 back into the game, and especially now if white plays a move like e4. Now this bishop is in serious business. So Adams, very much in keeping with the style he's adopting in this game, just plays the restrained h3, and black takes on d4, followed by another restrained move, h6. Not a bad idea, because there are certainly opportunities for white, if black doesn't play h6, to play bishop g5, and then perhaps even knight to d5. And that's an idea which black really doesn't want to seal the board. So he just plays a careful move, h6. And now comes bishop e3. Well, d5 has also been played, but I guess Adams doesn't do that, because he simply doesn't want the bishop on a7 to start playing. And it's just a question now of whether white can claim anything in this position. He seems to have a slight edge with 2 pawns in the centre. He's got good development. But on the other hand, this bishop on e3 is not ideally placed. I think white, if he could, would much rather have this bishop on b2. b3, bishop b2, and after that maybe d5. But of course it costs time to get the bishop to b2. So knight e7 is a good way to expose the bishop on e3. Perhaps Pert's thinking about coming up to f5 and lopping that bishop off. So Adams protects the bishop, and now this careful move, c6. A good move, I think, nothing wrong with it. In an earlier game, black played knight g6. c6. And Adams plays d5. Well, I guess he does that because he doesn't want black to play d5. This is what Pert's perhaps limbering up to do. If Adams makes a quiet move here, black will go d5 himself. And after that, knight f5 increases in impact. So d5 by white. Black is happy to exchange the pieces. And now Pert blocks with c5, reaching a kind of Benoni structure, which should be perfectly okay for him, as long as he plays it actively a bit later on. Well, already I think black's position is satisfactory. He doesn't only have one way to play the position. For instance, he could play knight f5 right away, driving the rook back and only now c5. Richard Pert probably didn't do that because he didn't want to be shoved away with g4 at some moment and lose a bit of time. Another approach for black is to take on d5. Nothing wrong with that, I think, and to try to make the d pawn a target. Of course, when you play this way, you've got to be aware you're weakening the c6 square, and that's probably why Pert didn't do it. You know, Mickey Adams is one of those players who, if you give him a weakness to play against, he's absolutely ruthless in exploiting these minute advantages. But is white so much better, for instance, after a3, bishop b7? After knight h4, to protect the pawn more than anything else, rook e8. Again, you know, black's position looks okay. Well, it's all stylistic. Pert plays c5, which should be fine for him, and Mickey plays queen to d2. Well, this is the first position where black can definitely consider b5. You know, if you could play this move and get away with it in a Benoni structure, why not do it? And I think here it actually gives black pretty good play. I think Pert should have done it. First point is that if white takes the pawn, well, I think black can even take on d5 and protect his bishop. If the rook goes backwards, we go bishop e6. This looks fine. And so probably after b5, b3 is more careful, but even there black can take on c4 and go rook b8. And it's hard to say why Richard didn't do that. I think that would have been okay for black. Instead, black goes cautious. He plays bishop d7. White doubled up. Black played knight g6. Queen to c2. And now we reach the second position in the game where black could have considered b5. The failure to go active against really strong players is often the source of defeat. And okay, I can see why Richard plays as he does, because he wants to get all the rooks off, trade them off on the e-file. He's going to put his rook on e8 and just chop off all the rooks. But again, b5 could have been considered. Looks even better now because white can't take twice. So probably he's got to content himself with b3, and then black could consider taking on c4, queen c8, opening up fire against h3, white protects, and then rook b8 again. I think you'd probably do this if you're playing flat out for the win, because you'd be avoiding exchanges. In general, the problem for black in this position is his pawn on d6, as it often is in Benoni structures. And we're going to see a bit later on that white can try and train his sights on this pawn. So this was also possible for black. Instead, queen c7 was played, and as advertised after knight d2, black is going through with his idea of chopping off some rooks on the e-file. So Adams restrains b5, and black takes on e3, followed by rook e8. Knight d e4. Here's the first sign that white is content to settle for some sort of technical edge in this position, and hope that this edge can increase as the game goes on. Black's probably got to take that knight, and now Adams took with the bishop. Well, he's training his sights on the knight at g6. If bishop takes h3, then I think bishop takes g6 is a good move, uncovering an attack against the unprotected rook. And if rook takes e3, there's the intermezzo bishop h7 check, and I think white wins. So Pert now has to choose between f8 and e5, a passive or an active move. He goes knight f8, very solid. Was knight e5 possible, with a double attack on c4 and h3? Well, the first point to note is that this is not really a double attack at all, as after bishop g2 protecting, black can't take on c4. After that, white's got a tactic. He can take on e8 and go queen e2, attacking the knight and the bishop. And if knight e5, then f4. So winning a pawn is out of the question. Therefore, after bishop g2, can black play a better move here? Well, I mean, he could try queen d8, and if queen e2 protecting the pawn, king f8, this looks pretty solid. And if knight e4 attacking d6, queen b8, b3, knight g6. I mean, this was another approach. This looks pretty solid for black, although the knight on g6 position is less than ideal. You have to say white's pieces are slightly better placed, but is he really better? Not so sure. So knight e5 was definitely a move here, but knight f8 was preferred. White protected his pawn, black went queen c8, renewing the attack, and white now went g4. Queen to d8. Rook f3 by Adams, and now I think, having played so solidly to date, Pert misses his opportunity. He played the plausible queen to g5, but much stronger here, and a move I think which probably transfers the advantage to black in this position, is h5. It's funny, you know, Pert has encouraged black to, Mickey to loosen his king side slightly, and I think this is the move to try to take advantage of this aspect of the position. Because what is white to do? Let's say he takes. The idea is to put the queen on h4. And now white's probably got nothing better here than going bishop f5. And after queen takes h5, to take on d7. Both rooks are hanging, so black's probably got to take that bishop, and now rook to g3, knight to f8, bring the knight back to g6, and claim that black's got some attack. Because if white goes knight takes d6 here, that's a bad move. In comes the black rook, and white suddenly, out of nowhere, is toast. So I think h5 might have turned the tables here and giving Mickey something to think about. Instead, after queen g5, white is able to press on with slightly better placed pieces and to enact his game plan of playing without risk and just trying to out-technique the opponent. Queen d4 was answered by queen f5, hitting f7, and now black played rook e7. Well, that leads him into passivity, so he perhaps could have also considered f6. Looks a bit loose, but the knight on f8 is covering all the squares, and if white goes rook f4, we can go queen e5. And after takes, it's funny, white can't take advantage of the pawn on d6 right away because of knight g6. So tactically, black is also able to keep himself afloat by these means. So rook e7, rook e4, queen to d2, rook to e4. Suddenly Adams is getting a slight edge, which is what he's been angling for all along. If he had played knight e4, black could play queen c1. And after knight d6, knight g6, again, black is on the verge of turning the tables. Well, he has turned the tables because the rook's attacked and knight h4 is threatened. So it's not so easy for white to just take that pawn off. Hence, rook e4 in the game, knight g6, queen c8 check, king h7, but now Adams is getting on top after rook takes e7 and then queen takes b7. Out of nowhere, black has lost a pawn and must now submit himself to the rather relentless technique of Michael Adams. Queen to e5. in this difficult situation, Black's got to avoid making things worse, and that's exactly how Pert plays over the next few moves. He tries to batten down the hatches by putting his queen in the centre and then pushing his pawn up to f6. It's a question now of how White makes progress. The problem for Black in this position is not so much the pawn down, because White hasn't got a passed pawn. It's the fact that he can't do very much. For instance, if he goes queen f6, White can make progress by putting the queen on the knight on h5 and just, well, I think the queen's overloaded. Got to maintain contact with the knight, and then we just chop the pawn with another pawn gained. So Black went f6. Again, the issue with that at the e6 square. White's looking now at manoeuvres with the queen to get into e6. He first of all tied Black down on the queen side. Mickey's attention to detail is legendary. Now comes h4. Black can do nothing. h5, tying the knight down. Queen goes to e5, and here comes the manoeuvre of the queen to e6, which actually should win the game. Pert was desperate. He tried f5, but after knight takes f5, queen e4 check, actually Black is soon going to run out of checks. The king goes to h3, and that is game over, because Black can't deal with all the threats. So the queens came off, and then f6 was the last move of the game. Black resigned, and he resigns because after g takes f6, the king marches in, something like this. King comes in, king goes to f7, and now White just makes a move which forces Black to give way. So rather than see that on the board, Pert resigns. Well, that's a typical example of the type of chess that is being played so far in Bournemouth by the best players. You know, very careful play, waiting for the opponent to make a mistake. Pert in this game definitely had his opportunities to play actively, but he continued to play solidly. When you play like that, you can often just, when you're concentrating on solid moves alone, miss an opportunity. And as we saw, back at 25 rook f3, Black's played very well to get to this position. He now had the opportunity to take on to play h5 and didn't do so. Well, if you don't take your opportunities against really strong players, they don't come around too often. So I thought that was a good game by Adams. An interesting game all the way through. I mean, not a game of fireworks by any stretch of the imagination, but a game which demonstrates grandmaster technique.